Don't forget, some things mustn't be forgotten. The shadow hunting me. I must hurry. My name is Daniel. I live in London at Mayfair. What have I done? This is crazy. Don't forget. Don't forget. I must stop him. Focus.
When you first load into Amnesia Dark Descent, you find out three vital things. Your name is Daniel,
Daniel.
you are being chased by something called the Shadow, and lastly, that you must stop him, whoever that is. While little is said about the Shadow or him, it sets the focus on the three facets of interactivity that will carry the game forward. Firstly, Daniel, the protagonist of the game who you are playing as, quite literally as the game is set in a POV style. Next, the Shadow, the looming threat you must look out for. Lastly, him, who you are trying to stop, and who you will later find out to be Alexander. These three forces of interactivity are a triangular puzzle that cannot coexist without each other. Each one of these pieces brings a different necessity to the game in order for it to work and achieve its goal. But what is Amnesia the Dark Descent trying to tell us about the genre it exists in and game theory in general? If you open Steam and find the game on the store, the developers describe it as a first person survival horror. While it's set in a first person setting, and you are surviving from the shadow, and at least in my opinion, it is quite scary, as you play through the game, you uncover different elements the same way Daniel uncovers hidden memories. You solve puzzles, embark on an adventure, and do a
You
lot of
have to be
walking,
swift
like a lot, etc.
when you
Despite the
activate the first
conflicting
button.
elements, I argue
You
that
hear that?
Amnesia The
If it
Dark Descent
stops,
is a
you'll have to
quintessential horror
start
game
over.
that explores what it
Is it
means to
always a
prioritize
bit
eliciting nonstop fear
excessive?
through the perfect
You can never
synergy
be
of
too
character,
careful,
plot,
Daniel.
and internal tension. In this case, the use of a monster. In his essay, Coming to Play at Finding Yourself, Welcome to the World of Horror Video Games, Bernard Perron quotes author Stephen Poole to discuss how video games can best reflect horror when it comes to traditional media genres. He quotes, "Why is it particularly the horror genre, and to a lesser extent science fiction, that largely provides the aesthetic compost for supposedly film-like video games? The answer is that horror genre can easily do away with character and plot. It is the detail of the monster, the rhythm of the tension, and the shocks that matter. Plot and characters are things video games find very difficult to deal with." Poole asserts, in this quote, that horror genre video games have an easier time reflecting components of traditional horror films because, oftentimes, the only thing that truly matters is the source of the horror. The other pervading elements are merely the tint that covers the horror being portrayed. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, topples these expectations and creates an experience that prioritizes all elements of storytelling in horror, with exceptional story building using Alexander as the main driver of the plot, a compelling main character in Daniel, and the rapid tension built by the shadow throughout the gameplay. Daniel is who we play as in the game. Despite spending several hours with Daniel, we never see as much as his hand. This is because the game is carefully driven in a POV style camera setting where the player's functions control everything Daniel sees and by extension what the player sees. While this means we never get to catch a glimpse of our protagonist, what it achieves is personifying ourselves into the character and, in many ways, embodying the emotions and thoughts they come to terms with throughout the gameplay. The, g- the game utilizes two important game mechanics that we must manage to keep Daniel in a stable condition and our gameplay smooth. We have to handle his sanity level, a measure of how scared Daniel gets, or else he will begin to act erratically, shaking the screen and even causing the character to fall to the ground. On top of this, we must manage the health bar, which can be affected by taking damage. I believe that the most dynamic of these is the sanity bar, which has a way of passing off the anxiety and dread to the player felt by Daniel. It is, in my opinion, the game mechanic with the clearest link between the player and the in game character. The darker the room got, the more noises I heard, and the glimpse of the shadow not only lowered Daniel's sanity, but it was the provider of nonstop fear I felt throughout the game. I didn't just tiptoe away from the shadow for the sake of Daniel. It was for mine as well. Talking about the shadow, let's discuss the big bad wolf in our story. The shadow is very much prevalent throughout the game, as it is a monster attention builder and a strong horror media piece. However, there were certain aspects of the shadow that allowed for everything to piece together. Firstly, the imminent threat of the shadow popping out while you're completing a diary task plays a big component in keeping you on task and progressing the story along. Without the feeling that a monster was breathing down my neck, I might have spent more time looking for oil or tinder boxes. But the eeriness and tension made me want to finish things as efficiently as possible to avoid the shadow. This allows the devs a level of authority over the player. In traditional horror films, the director holds an authoritarian grasp over the film as the story is preset, with the ending already set in place before the viewer begins watching. Much the same, the shadow allows the devs to nudge the player into a certain direction, so that you are not just mindlessly wandering around and turning the game into a walking simulator. Every action and step the player takes is intentional as the shadow looms. The shadow is able to utilize noises, jump scares, and even our own paranoia to create tension in the game. Every gust of wind, every open door, every growl, etc., can be pointed back to the shadow, even if they weren't the cause of it at all. This is what makes the shadow such a compelling quote unquote monster for a story, as it utilizes psychological horror to delve deep into the minds of the player, where you always have to account for the possibility of it lingering in the hallway you are about to step into. To tie everything together, let's discuss the plot. Alexander, the man you're after, is the main plot device that drives the story forward. To rehash the beginning of the game, you load in knowing three things: your name is Daniel, the shadow is after you, and lastly, you have to get him. At the beginning of the game, we don't know why exactly we are after Alexander, but as you progress through the story, the devs leave crumbles of information in the form of journal entries that allow you to pick apart the story piece by piece. This is the most locked into place you'll ever be in the game. Every time you get to an important room or journal entry, you're locked into an unskippable cutscene. Except most of the time, it isn't a cutscene at all. It's pieces of unskippable audio that allow you to delve into Daniel's story and his connection to the castle, and most importantly, Alexander. This is the biggest departure from film like horror games, as unskippable audio is not exactly cinematic, but it uniquely completes the same goal as cutscenes do by giving important information to the player to address discrepancies there may be between what the player knows and what in game characters might have been able to decipher on their own. While it does defy some facets of traditional film like horror games, it gives a fresh new spin that was great within the bounds of the story and achieves similar goals.
17th May, 1839. After pounding the unforgiving stone wall for what seemed like an eternity, I realized it was hopeless. I was trapped. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, trying to focus. That's when I saw a faint blue shimmer. My weakened body was heavy to carry, but I managed to push myself toward the enchanting light. It was waiting for me. Enclosed in dark nothingness, I felt myself drawn to the mystic light. I reached out, closing it in my hands. The faint glow escaped my fingers and began to spark brightly and spirit me away, unlocking alien memories of spiraling towers, endless deserts, and impossible geometry. The next thing I can remember is the grating sound of stone being lifted, the voices of the Arabs pulling me to safety, and grasped firmly in my hands was the broken pieces of a most peculiar relic.
To conclude, in a genre often defined by its ability to evoke fear through sheer scares, Amnesia: The Dark Descent transcends as a quintessential horror experience. Through Daniel, the Shadow, and Alexander, the game is able to take the player through a narrative journey that blurs the lines between player and character experience, furthering its psychological impact. The player is able to become an active participant in the non-stop horror occurring without sacrificing any aspects of what makes a strong horror media. It doesn't only rely on cheap scares, monsters, or tension to drive the story.